Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome.
It's great to have everybody here. Welcome to Western Australia. Surf looks good, doesn't it?
Yeah. So we are talking about Australia's Margaret River. This is our first New World between two Somms, which I was really excited to do some research on and put the presentation together. You know, if you're in the wine business long enough, it seems like you get to go just about everywhere cool. And I have yet to get myself to Australia. And after putting this together, I really have a strong desire to visit Margaret River. So such a beautiful place. We're talking about the west coast of Australia. And it's really quite isolated from the rest of Australia. The wine region itself, and it's sort of sparsely populated, but what a stunningly beautiful place we have in Margaret River.
Indeed. I have several reasons to visit. You know, I got to get back to that.
Yeah, hey, so here's Ron Edwards. Hey, a lot of people probably don't know, but Ron is a lifelong surfing enthusiast. And when I first met him, he lived in Michigan, and I said, "Where do you surf in Michigan?" He said, "Lake Michigan, of course." I'm like, "Wow, that's gotta be cold."
I'll have to get one of those pictures out for next week.
All right, but yeah, hey, check it out.
That's actually not me.
Here's the real Ron Edwards. That is you, right?
That it really is me in El Salvador in 2014.
Amazing. All right.
It was a good day.
So, Western Australia. So how did this develop? So we're talking about the far west coast of Australia. And as I mentioned, it's quite isolated from the rest of the wine growing regions of Australia, the wine growing states of Australia, and sort of sparsely populated. The big city here, of course, is Perth. But when we talk about New World wine regions, wine growing regions, and we talk about Napa Valley, for example, or California, that's actually quite old and established compared to this place, because really the first vineyards in Western Australia didn't really appear until the 60s, and finally in the 70s we saw Margaret River start to be planted. Yep. So it's a very, very young wine growing region, isn't it?
It is.
So, you know, first colonists arrive here in 834, and the first vines are planted in the Swan district, just north of Perth there. And you know, it's quite hot in the Swan district. So, of course, as you go north in Australia, we get to warmer and drier climates. And so quite warm. And what the first vintners here focused on were sweet wines and stickies and that sort of thing. But eventually from this area, this wine called Houghton White Burgundy emerged. And this was a huge hit in Australia. This was like a national hit. Everybody drank this stuff. It's based on Chenin Blanc. But it's got other stuff in it too, Chardonnay, and I don't know, some aromatic varieties as well. But that's kind of the old, or sort of first well-known wine that came from Western Australia. And then later on, we started to see some vineyards planted in the Great Southern area. Plantagenet was an important producer here. So that was in the 60s. Finally, in the 70s, this area called Grape, we started to see some vineyards there. That's really close to this area called Margaret River that we're talking about today. But we're getting sort of honed in and closer to this region that is our focus today, Margaret River. So in the 1970s, we finally started to see the first wines emerge out of this Margaret River area. So here's one of the original producers here. It's Vas Felix. In fact, that is the first commercial vineyard planted in Margaret River, was the great winery at Vas Felix here.
Yes, thank you, Tom Colletti, Dr. Tom Colletti. And what's interesting is, you know, we have a lot of influence from people outside of Australia telling them you should plant grapes here, right? You got Harold Olmo from California doing a little research in Perth and then saying, oh, wait a minute, have you seen what's south of here? You know, you should plant down there. And Robert and Davi doing research. We'll talk about it a little later. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Right.
So a very, very young wine growing region, and probably at one point was better known for its timber industry in the 19th century. But today is for sure, I think we would say, Western Australia's most renowned, most famous region. There's almost 200 producers here. They're also famous for their surfing, of course. Yeah. But yeah, more than 200 producers. Mm-hmm. Ron?
Yeah, I was just saying yes to the surf. Absolutely. It's one of the rare places in the world where you can go to a winery and a surf shop within 2 or 3, like walking distance of each other. It's pretty, I'm ready to go. I didn't get there on my trip to Australia. Yeah. I was ready to go. I went to Tasmania instead.
And just looking at and studying this region a little bit and just looking at all of the on now more than 200 producers here operation. I mean, most of these producers are quite medium or a boutique in size, and they are very, very quality oriented. So we don't really, this isn't really a region for bulk wine production or anything like that. They're really sort of aiming for the premium end of the market. So what's really sets this region? Why is this the premier wine region of Western Australia? Well, I think it has a lot to do with their very, very unique terroir and their very unique situation. Let's talk about a few of these things that makes it unique. First, starting with, I think, the climate. We have what I guess we would call a Mediterranean climate, but this moderate climate, very much maritime influenced, as the map would indicate, meaning that you get great intensity of sunlight here, but it also stays nice and fresh, so ocean cooled. And studying this region, looking at it a little more closely, I just kept thinking it's so much like some of the wine growing areas of California, and so much like Bulgaris. We're talking about west coastal area on the west coast of the country, and they sort of have this same situation of intense sunlight, as well as keeping the freshness thanks to the ocean. So it's, speaking of ocean, surrounded on 3 sides by ocean. And Ron?
Yeah, so you have Geograph Bay to the north. To the north and west, you have the southern reaches of the Indian Ocean, which we think of as a warm ocean. But by the time you get that far south, it's actually a very cool ocean. And then coming up from the south, you have the Southern Ocean, which we'll talk about in greater detail, which is a very wild and woolly, very chilly place. It definitely takes this idea, we think of Mediterranean climates and we often think of them as always really warm, like Southern Rhone warm, or maybe the upper reaches of Napa Valley. And that's not always, and when you have a cool water influence, it changes it dramatically.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because one thing that I think Australian wineries and Wine Australia has been doing a really great job of is they've been out telling the market about all of their awesome cool climate zones and the cool climate wine growing that's happening in Australia right now. And this is sort of, before really that was a buzzword or anybody was talking about that, this was a region that's really sort of based on a cooler climate. So, part of that, I suppose, is the winds, which is a challenge here in the spring. So they have some really strong winds, and you get, especially like in Chardonnay, the hens and chicks, the uneven berry set and everything, but sunny and warm summers, nice and dry. So this all just sounds ideal, doesn't it? And then you've got these, we'll speak about this quite a bit today, but these really fantastic free draining, deep, well-drained gravelly loam. So you'll see in some references, they call them gravel stone soils or these ironstone soils, but this is a real key to the premium wine growing that happens here. It's all kind of setting up very similarly to Bordeaux, isn't it? It looks a lot like it. So yeah, and this yes, Ron, go ahead.
I was just going to say the big difference is color of the soil is red. There's a ferrous nature to the soil, but it's ideal for grape growing. Ideal. Yeah.
And there's these really almost, we call them ancient soils of this granite bedrock layered with limestone. We'll have a look at that in a moment. And this, I actually did not know this, but there is no phylloxera in Margaret River. Is that, I was so surprised to read that, but then you think, well, yeah, just look at how it's geographically isolated from the rest of Australia and surrounded by water on three sides, and that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, and it could have come in by accident at some point, but somehow they avoided it, and now they're very, very careful about it. And a lot of the cuttings came from right there. So after they started, you know, instead of bringing in cuttings from other places that could have brought phylloxera with it, they have maintained using their own nursery cuttings, and so that's altered a lot. And so, yeah, let's talk about wind for a second. This map is a really great picture of exactly why Western Australia, and then of course even down Tasmania, and then you can see New Zealand down there. They're all benefiting or being or suffering from this idea of the major wind forces and weather forces of the roaring 40s and furious 50s. The roaring 40s in the southern latitude, if you just take a look at that map, you can see that from the eastern shores of South America to Tasmania, there is no land. There's nothing to stop the ocean and its power from, no blocking, no mountains to climb over. And so you're seeing some sort of gale happening in the roaring 40s pretty much once a week. And some of those large storms can cover 2,000 square, like 2,000 miles wide, just one storm, like giant hurricane type stuff. Well, all of that is pushing that water, the weather, the winds all towards Australia. And those dominant winds blow the cool water from the south up towards to this giant island, right? And that's why you have cold water on Western Australia instead of, even though the land is very warm, you'd think it'd be warm water, but it's not, it's the opposite. And so the water around Margaret River up through Geographe Bay ranges normally from about 61 degrees Fahrenheit up to maybe 70, unless you have a strong offshore wind and it sucks the deep water up on shore. So that's one of those things, like now you're talking about the same sort of feel that you have in California, where although Northern California water is much colder, you get the same idea where, okay, it could be hot here, but this constant onshore flow, unless there's a weather system to push the air the other direction, is cooling it down all the time.
These prevailing winds probably explain a little bit of this, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And so here's an example of Margaret River's. It's just an average weather system. So your growing season, peak growing season, is January and February, and you'll notice that they're topping out on average of 81 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not very warm for 33 degrees south latitude. I mean, it would be 95 degrees or more, no problem, without the ocean influence. So that's just, and you can see here that Mediterranean idea where almost all the rain happens in that core winter time, which is perfect because it saturates the ground, gets ready for spring, and away you go.
Cool. So this is something we read about a lot when we're studying the Margaret River, as they're always talking about these gravelly loam soils, these very just perfect, well-draining soils that are nutrient deficient, which slows the vigor of the vine. But this is a really important aspect of wine growing here. So not only do we have this perfect climate for Bordeaux varieties, but the soils themselves sort of mimic or resemble those of Bordeaux as well. So of course, this is a great region for Bordeaux. I'll need you to explain this, Ron, the Lewin Naturaliste Ridge.
Sure. So the Naturaliste Ridge is a bedrock uprising, or maybe it's a better way to think of it as everything else eroded around it and left it behind because it's really hard rock. So this is mostly granite, granite that was deposited and created through heat and pressure over, a long, long time ago. Oldest rock formations on Earth right here. Sorry about that. So you're talking about 150 to 600 million years in geologic time with some really young limestone at 2 million years mixed in. And what you're dealing with is inert, kind of lifeless opportunity for vines, which keeps the soil from keeps them from being vigorous. So the vines keep that balance of, I need to make fruit, not leaves. And that's just a really great natural thing for them.
Sounds like we're set up for success here. There is more than just, first of all, more than just Bordeaux varieties and Cabernet Sauvignon being grown in Margaret River, but also not only that, but even within this small region of Margaret River. So we're talking about a region that's just 60 miles from north to south and just 19 miles from west to east. Small, compact, but there is within that diversity of climate, diversity of soil. And so there's no official subzones or subregions yet, but some have been proposed. And I think, Ron, you were just telling me actually that things seem to be moving along for at least one of these areas, though. Willebroek, hope I'm saying that right.
Willebroek looks like a couple of months ago I saw a note, meaning I saw a note today that a couple of months ago they were given the provisional status of like, yeah, we're pushing you forward. This is probably going to be reality. So we should be looking to see that sort of become like Eden Valley or is for Barossa Valley, where it's a sub-district kind of thing.
Well, and it makes sense because when you start looking at where the producers are, the really established, famous producers of this region where they're located, there's a great concentration of them in this Willebroek area. And you also find that it's very intensely planted with Cabernet Sauvignon. So this may be, if Margaret River is one of the premier Cabernet growing regions for Australia, then Willebroek is just, it's the apex, right? Very much Cabernet territory there and other Bordeaux varieties. And then another region that kept coming up in my research is Wallcliffe, and hopefully I'm saying that correctly. But as I'm getting really good with PowerPoint here. So I made a little diagram. You see that as you go north, we're getting warmer. As you go south, cooler. And so as you go south, it tends to be more white grapes planted. And this is where you find Chardonnay, which is very distinctive here, but also Semillon and Sauvignon varieties, and there's even a bit of Chenin Blanc here. So it tends to be more white grapes down there, whereas they've got Bordeaux varieties more in the north. So speaking of Cabernet, this is for sure one of the premier Cabernet Sauvignon wine growing regions of Australia. Right from the get-go, with Vas Felix's success in the early 70s and those other sort of pioneering early wineries, it was recognized as a great place for Cabernet Sauvignon. And you hear it described as, it's often described as sort of Bordeaux style, maybe a little riper than what you typically find in Bordeaux, but always with this sort of unique finesse and freshness that you wouldn't really find in Southern Australia, some of those regions. So that's really what makes this area distinctive. A lot of producers treating the wines that they make an awful lot like Bordeaux. So you'll find definitely a lot of blending going on with Malbec, Merlot, Petit Verdot, but this is Cabernet territory. The Heritage Houghton clone run. Do you know much? Have you done much research on that?
I haven't done a ton of research on it. I took it as stated fact that this is, what they've been growing there for a while, and because they've been keeping their cuttings themselves, it just makes a lot more sense that that they have their own heritage clone, and I think that's really cool that they keep doing that. I think it's interesting that you bring up the comparison to Bordeaux, because I've often told people it's like a halfway point between European wine and California wine as far as its weight, style, richness, etc. But then earlier you brought up Bulgari, and I'm thinking, that's a pretty good approximation, because those wines are lush but not overly powerful. They have a depthness to them too, and the Margaret River just has a powerful elegance to their wines that's really attractive, especially when you talk about Cabernet blends.
Well, and really all of the wines that come out of this region have they're distinctive from the rest of Australia, and that goes for Shiraz too. And it's Margaret River is not as famous as South Australia, Barossa, of course, for Shiraz, but there's a good amount planted there, and you get more almost Northern Rhone style. Once again, it's a little more on the finesse and the freshness of Syrah, but you also really get this distinctive sort of pepperiness and gaminess from these Shiraz that you find here. So, Chardonnay.
It wasn't too long ago. I opened a bottle of that less than Shiraz. It had a few years of bottle age on it, and it was just gorgeous. It had all the things I want from Syrah. You know, little pepper, little smoked meat, the herbs. It was just gorgeous.
Totally, that's my kind of Shiraz. I really wanted to spend a little time talking about Chardonnay, because it's you know, there's Chardonnay everywhere in the wine growing, wherever wine grows. There seems to be Chardonnay, but here it's truly a distinctive wine. So the really famous, you know, very first producer that was known for Chardonnay out of this area is Lewin and their Art Series Chardonnay. And they had a wine that Decanter voted as the best Chardonnay in the world in 1980. It's once again a really distinctive style of Chardonnay, in my opinion. And it's a lot of it has to do with this Gin clone that you read about. And I didn't know until my research today, it's the same clone as the Wente clone. So there you have it. Maybe it has something to do with Robert Mondavi's influence in this area.
Yeah, an interesting story there. Robert Mondavi came to Southwest Australia, looking around, checking things out, and he had already well begun his empire. And he saw a piece of property that the Lewins owned, or the family owned, and wanted to buy it from them. And they were like, "Well, if you want to buy it, maybe it's worth something. We should plant it ourselves." And ended up that Robert Mondavi sort of acted as a consultant for them instead of owning it, and got a partnership in the process. And I'm sure the Wente clone choice had something to do with his advice.
Well, whenever you read about these wines, you read about how their mouth coating, how textural they are, and this is sort of the identity of this Margaret River Chardonnay. And I say that with also having tasted in very recent times some Chardonnays out of this area that have a lot of freshness, a lot of acidity. There's tension in the wines. I'd even maybe go as far as to say some of them have an austerity to them. And that's been only some wines that like Mark Davidson has been showing me, and it's just, wow, it's incredible how much finesse and tension and acidity these wines can have, at least in more recent times. So, so there's a lot of top names here producing some great Chardonnay. Vas Felix is a great producer, but Lewin, of course, is the winery that put Margaret River Chardonnay on the map with their Art Series.
Yeah, and I've had those wines with bottle age, and in the New World concept of Chardonnay in the New World, I have a hard time liking anything better than I like out of Margaret River. There's just a beautiful tension and balance in these wines across the board at all levels of power and richness. And some of them are so lean, and you look at the pHs and it's the same pH as Chablis.
I was just reading a Jancis Robinson review of some of these Margaret River Chardonnays, and they were drinking, you know, wines with 10, 15 years on, and she was remarking how remarkably fresh they were. And yeah, I was going to mention that they've proven to be impressively long-lived as well. So they've got a very unique thing on their hands with these Chardonnays out of Margaret River. And then we should talk about, and this makes sense to me, if Cabernet Sauvignon and the other red Bordeaux varieties work so well here, we should probably expect to see success with Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc as well. These are, from my understanding, really popular in Australia, and I think are slowly catching on in the international market. But these blends of Semillon and Sauvignon, and they tend to be produced in this really sort of fresh, clean style, which can range anywhere from vibrant, tropical, you know, sort of have more of these ripe tropical flavors, to some wines that are leaner with more herbaceousness. And it sort of depends not only on where exactly in Margaret River they're grown, but also the components. So you'll hear producers talk about an SSB or an SBS. It just is how much Semillon versus Sauvignon is in their blend. But these are really interesting to me. Always, almost, at least the ones I've tasted, are in stainless steel, and the intent is to be crisp and have acidity and freshness in these wines. So.
And another set of white wines from Margaret River that age really well. I've recently had a Howard Park with, 4 years of bottle age in Stelvin, and it was actually, I think it was probably better when I tried it than the day it was released. It started to have that slightly more developed and oily, richer texture that Semillon gets with time. It's really pretty wine. Really, really enjoyed it.
So I wanted to, since this is such a new region, and I think it's a really exciting region in Australia to be talking about, I wanted to sort of give a little bit of a spotlight on some of the pioneers of this region. And I think we, of course, first have to start with Vas Felix, which is the first commercial vineyard planted in here. And it's quite funny when you see these first 3 or 4 wineries that established themselves here in the late 60s, early 70s. They're all doctors, and it's sort of a random fact. But this is Dr. Tom Colity in 19, first commercial vineyard here, and one of the, you have to give them credit for one of the wineries that put Margaret River Cabernet Sauvignon on the map, making the style known internationally. But there's also some really, really good Chardonnay from this producer and other varieties as well. So an all-around great estate here, and one of the, well, the first to plant vineyards here. And some other early wineries here, Mosswood, known for its Cabernet Sauvignon. A lot of these wineries are in this Willowbrook area. So this is this area that we were speaking of earlier that probably will be an official subzone sometime very soon. And it's where we have this real intensity of Cabernet Sauvignon, Bordeaux variety plantings. Cullen, another very early winery here, starting in the early 70s, founded in 71, known for their reds, their red blends, Cabernet, and other Bordeaux wines, and very interestingly certified biodynamic. Very, it's been organic since '98, but now certified biodynamic. There's our Lewin estate, and we already spoke of them, but the story of, I don't know if we mentioned that, but they had the people that own Lewin estate or founded it had a plumbing business, and they had bought some land that was being used for like cattle grazing or something, and they were only convinced to plant it to grapes when Robert Mondavi got interested. It's a very interesting story there. Probably helped explain the reason that there's a windtake loan. And also, most of these cuttings for Chardonnay in the Margaret River can't come from Lewin Estate. So as you said, they're not necessarily bringing in a lot of plant material from other places and preserving that phylloxera-free growing situation that they're so fortunate to have there. But you then have is this proliferation of this Gingin clone that probably came almost exclusively from Lewin Estate. Kate Mantell, I just wanted to mention them. Not only are they a pioneering early winery here, but David Honan would eventually found Cloudy Bay in Marlborough, and that was the wine that sort of put
that worked out okay for him.
Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc on the map. Yeah, that was a good move. But definitely known for Cabernet Sauvignon and a really excellent Sauvignon Blanc Semillon blend as well. So and maybe a couple more of these just to cover all our bases on these original producers here in Margaret River. Woodlands, top producer of Cabernet Sauvignon. Voyager stayed doing really, really good red and white wine, but particularly one source of Chardonnay, kind of in the same sort of neighbor of Lewin Estate. So, we have a handful of excellent wines that we import from Margaret River. Vas Felix, very proud to represent them. And Howard Park, which is a definite producer, both of Margaret River wines and Great Southern, from the Hill Smith family of Yalumba Ringbolt. these are some really excellent Cabernet Sauvignon from Margaret River. Maybe, Ron, do we have a few questions to answer? Usually right around this time, there's a couple.
Well, there was a question earlier I answered about the coolness of the ocean versus the Earth's core temperatures and the depth of the ocean, but that was more geology. But here's one. Our vintage is fairly consistent in Margaret River, and I would say the answer is yes. They're actually consistent to a point of other parts of the world being remarkably jealous of how consistent they are, based on what you saw in that weather graph, how the growing season is very well defined. The water's almost exclusively in the wintertime. They have, granite is impermeable rock underneath, so there's a water table that stays near the surface to keep them, and they can use irrigation if that doesn't work out. Never getting very hot, never getting very cold. I mean, it's just, Jancis Robinson probably said it best and basically called it wine paradise, quote unquote. So they're remarkably consistent. It's one of those places you can go to year in, year out, not question per se. It's just knowing which producer you like.
I had a really fun time putting that together this week, and just as I said earlier, it makes me badly want to go visit this region and check these wineries out for myself. But we're going to talk about wines from the area around Lisbon next week. So wines that come from near the capital of Portugal, and that's there's a lot of really interesting, very unique wines that come from this particular part of Portugal. So that we're looking forward to. And Ron, anything else to add? You just want to get out there, don't you?
Yeah, I definitely want to get out there. It's way better than sitting in my house all the time because of our current scenario. But the blessing of the scenario is that we've been doing this together every week, and that's a really great joy. And nice. I just saw the arrow.
John Williams just asked if there are any vines on Rottnest Island, and I don't know what that is. I don't know. I'm sorry. We'll have to look that up. And and Ralph, area not known for Shiraz. Actually, it's not as famous as certainly other areas in Australia, but there's a good amount planted there, and it's quite distinctive. So it has its own unique identity in Margaret River. There's more, to me, more freshness, and maybe they're in some areas a little lighter style than certainly than Barossa, but you definitely get this this sort of spicy pepperiness and gaminess from my experience. So yeah, there's definitely some Shiraz there, and some of it's really good.
So Ian had a good point that he had read that 2017 was the coolest vintage they've had there in 10 years. Well, okay, what's that mean? They have the growing degree days for Margaret River are 1,885 on average. Okay, so I think Burgundy's right in the neighborhood of 1,500. Bordeaux is around 1,800 to 2,000 depending on the year, and so the Southern Rhone is over 2,500. So we're not talking about an area that's ever considered a warm region, but it's never cool enough where they're risking not getting ripe. They can hang their grapes as long as they need to there. So you're still going to get level of ripeness that you need out of it to make a really nice, ripe, fully mature wine. It might mean that it's a little fresher, a little more acid driven than usual, but no harm in that, right? Just probably means
if they normally say it's a very similar climate to Bordeaux, and the wines are quite close to the style of Bordeaux, but maybe a little riper. Maybe 17 gets it even more, a little bit in line. Typically think of as a Bordeaux style. We've got a great question here. What's the difference in style between Coonawarra and Margaret River Cabernet? I really think of Coonawarra as having a lot of power to them. They've got great structure. They're quite dense. They've got muscle behind them. Whereas I think typically what we would say of Margaret River Cabernet is that they're much more finessed, more elegant. They have a certain sort of freshness to them. And aromatically, they're they're probably less ripe and big, bold black flavors, whereas you would definitely have that in Coonawarra. Coonawarra wines are massive wines.
Yeah, and the other thing that Coonawarra brings in a classic sense is that eucalyptus undertone just by nature of where it is. I think that there's a range of styles in both places, so you have to, you know, but Margaret River wines are different. The best way to figure that out is to buy a few bottles of each, invite some friends over, and figure it out, because that's
Good
how it
plan.
shows up.
Ron, let's be sure we do that when we're able to drink wine together. Let's make sure we do that and do a little comparison tasting. Thank you everyone for attending, for tuning in to Between Two Somms, and check us out next week. We're going to talk about the wine growing regions around Lisbon. So we're looking forward to that. Ron?
Yep. It's great
signing off.
with you. I'll see you soon.
See you next week.
Yep. Bye.